What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another episode of A Point in Focus, the official podcast of pointsinfocus.com and the Points in Focus YouTube. I'm Jason, and if you're new to these podcasts, this is basically the corner of the internet where I sit down and talk about stuff in photography, cinematography, camera gears, lenses, whatever, that is at least related to that kind of thing and is interesting me and sparking some thoughts. So, 2 weeks ago now, basically 2 weeks ago now, Canon announced the EOS C50. They announced it on September 9th, and it's supposed to ship sometime in Q4 of this year. So that's what I want to talk about. Now, I am not a Canon anything. I don't have standing with Canon. They don't give me gear. They don't give me preview gear, etc. None of that stuff at all. So I do not get access to equipment before it's actually released. And therefore, I obviously can't talk about detailed performance information about the camera or anything like that because I don't have one to test. Of course, this also means that I evaluate what I'm buying. I have to look at what the features are, what's being offered, and whether or not it's worth me to spend my money on, because if I'm not being given it, I have to buy it like most of you. And so there are pros and cons to everything. It's the reality is there's no such thing as the best camera. There's really only the best camera for you at a specific point in time and in a specific certain circumstance. And we all have to make our decisions on when, where, what, and how that all plays out. So to start with, I want to start by talking a little bit about where I see the market position of this camera falling, because it's I think it's interesting in some respects, and it certainly, I think, plays into the discussion in a pretty significant way. So this is clearly intended to be the successor to the R5C. Instead of it being a transitional or a bridge device, it's now a pure cinema camera device. So it's gone from the R5 plus the cinema moniker to just the straight cinema C50 moniker. There's some physical changes that come with this that I think both are pros, and they make sense in the context of this being a more cinema-oriented replacement to the R5C. So for starters, it's slightly smaller and slightly lighter. Its dimensions are 143 by 88 by 95 millimeters versus 142 by 101 by 111 millimeters. So not too much smaller, at least in width, but that's expected. That's the grip and everything. But in terms of height and depth, it's appreciably smaller than the R5C, it's should be noticeably smaller, let's put it that way. It's also 655 grams when empty versus 680 grams. Obviously, put batteries and stuff in, it's going to be heavier, but if you're talking E6P batteries on both cameras, well, that's the same weight add there, so it moves up on that road. There's no EVF, which I think is a big discussion point depending on, especially if the R5C was an interest camera at the time, all things considered. Now, when I bought my R5C, I had an R5, and I have gone through, I've always had at least two bodies for almost as long as I've been doing photography. And for the first 10 plus years of that, my approach was I would buy the new camera, whatever was current from, in my case, I shoot Canon, so it was Canon. I would keep my old primary camera and make that my backup camera, and then I would sell my backup camera, my old backup camera, because I didn't need a third body. So like when I bought my first 5D Mark IV, I kept my 5D Mark III, which was my old primary camera, and I sold, at that time I had a 1D Mark III as my then backup camera, and I sold my 1D Mark III to move forward and finance everything. What made the R5C attractive to me is that it was basically an R5, but running the Cinema EOS OS with a thermally managed sensor processor system so that I didn't have to go back and forth between two different essentially user interfaces or platforms. I had an R5, I had an R5C. There are small subtle differences between the two, namely the lack of image stabilization on the R5C, but it wasn't the same kind of change in interface that you had, say, going from a 5D Mark IV to an R5, or a 5D Mark III to a 5D Mark IV, or anything like that. And so I really, at the very end of my time in DSLRs, I ended up with two 5D Mark IVs as my primary and backup camera, and I thought that was an absolutely fantastic way to work because I could have two absolutely identical cameras. I never had to worry about, was I compromising something with my setup, or was I having to, pick which camera I was going to put on which lens, or for that matter, when it came to actually the user interface and using the cameras, they were both identical. And that was a big selling point for me on the R5C, is it functionally, it was identical in terms of controls and function to the R5. Well, that's not the case with the C50 anymore. It is not functionally identical to the R5 Mark II. The big one that you may notice is that there's no EVF. Now, the more I've shot video, the less I use the EVF on my cameras. I almost always am using the LCD. And so I don't think that that is a bad thing. Necessarily, but it also does kind of compromise the whole dual OS hybrid thing that they're still doing on this camera. So it's still using an R5C-like dual operating system design. So in video mode, you get the Cinema EOS OS. In photo mode, you get the Photo EOS or the hybrid EOS OS. Well, without an EVF putting it into photo mode, now granted, I don't hardly shoot anything on my R5C anymore, shoot photos on my R5C anymore because I shoot almost all video on it at this point. But not having an EVF does kind of, I think, complicate that some. On the flip side, it's also the only other cinema camera that I can tell, or that I recall, that has a simple remote release connector. So on the R5, R3, R1, 5Ds, etc., Canon uses their proprietary N3 connector. That's the funny little 3-pin thing on the front of the camera. On almost all of the rest of the EOS R series cameras, they use the E3 connector, which is just a 2.5mm tip ring shield, headphone jack style connector. Remote releases make a ton of sense on a photo camera. Now, I'm not a huge production, and I tend to work solo almost all the time. And simple remote releases are a big deal to me in my shooting because I put a Pocket Wizard on, or any other kind of remote radio trigger, but I happen to have Pocket Wizards from back when I did photography, and I put Pocket Wizard on my cameras, and the N3 or E3, that simple remote release port, it is basically just wired in parallel with the shutter release. So you short the shoot or shutter connection to the ground connection on that pin, and it's the same as pushing the shutter release down, and away you go. And it makes it very easy when I'm running multiple cameras, or I'm in front of the camera like I am now, to have this in my pocket and hit the button and start the camera recording, hit the button again a second time to stop the camera recording, etc. It's a very simple system to use, and it's also very adaptable. So you can get, obviously, for years people have made, because Canon's N3 connector is, if you were using remote releases, basically 3.5 millimeter TRS to N3 connector adapters. And in fact, Canon makes a N3 to 2.5 millimeter E3 adapter for their own cameras so that you can take your old remote releases, or timer remotes, the TC80 N3, the RS80 or the RS60 N3, and plug them into this adapter and then plug them into any of the cameras that use the E3 port, which also now includes the R50 or C50. So where does that put it in the product line? Well, I find it hard. The R5C sat basically as the more upscale video version of the R5. And if your primary focus is video, then the C50 is the more upscale version of the R5C, or the more down market version of the C80. So it sits higher compared to like where the R5C sat. I mean, technically the R5C and the C50 probably would be argued at the same level. But from a video perspective, I think the R5 or the C50 is a little bit more video focused and a little bit higher market compared to the R5C in video. But if you're photo focused, the C50 is going to be a step backwards from the R5. So probably, if you shoot 60% video, 40 or 60% photo, 40% video, I don't know how good of an upgrade this is going to be if you already have an R5C, or to just get another R5 Mark II or an R1, versus if you shoot 60 or 70% video versus photo. It, though, is definitely less high-end than the C80, and that, of course, is less high-end than the C400. On the same token, given its size and weight, it's going to be a really good gimbal camera. The R5C is already pretty decent for that, but in this case, it's smaller and lighter than the R5C, so it's going to be a much better cinema-focused. Again, if you're working like in Canon's ecosystem and you want a cinema-focused camera or a video-focused camera shooting on a gimbal, I think this is the best option that they have right now. Not nearly as big and heavy as the C80, so you can use a smaller, lighter gimbal, not limited in quite the same ways as the R5 Mark II or R5C, depending on which way you're looking at it or coming from, in terms of a record time and so forth. So that's, I think, where the market position puts it. Now, Canon has done a bunch of things on this that I think make it part of that up marketing in the video world. So first of all, they have a grip module that comes with it that provides proper full-sized XLR inputs with phantom power. I really like this. So I have never been a fan of the multifunction shoe thing that Canon did with their cameras, and the fact that Tascam was the only company that made an interface for it. And that's not to say that I have anything against Tascam for their audio interfaces or recorders. I used a Tascam audio recorder for years and years and years. It was perfectly fine. It was a good little recorder. But Tascam wants almost as much for their audio interface for the R5 Mark II, the R5C, etc., and it has no recording functionality as Zoom or Sound Devices wants for a 2-channel or 4-channel field recorder that does 32-bit float recording. And yes, I know they're different things, and an external recorder versus something that records directly to your file is a completely different cup of tea. But I really like seeing that Canon is taking that cinema EOS camera approach with this. There are audio inputs on the C80, there are audio inputs on the C400, and now we have audio inputs on the C50, full-size XLR powered, etc. Yet, because it's an external grip and because it is not a built-in part of the camera, it cuts weight and we can take it off. which again goes back to what I was saying about gimbals. On a gimbal, you don't really need that extra weight and balance problem of that grip. So being able to take it off, I think, makes that really nice. Canon's also put on the grip a record, start, stop button and a zoom rocker. So for people who like really low angle shooting from a hand, top grip, you have that. And this is a function that's, as far as I know, not actually available on any of the other Cinema EOS cameras. So again, makes it kind of interesting from that situation. Now, I have seen a couple videos of other people talking about this. And one of the things that I saw that came up quite frequently is the lack of internal neutral density filters. And I would love to have internal ND on this camera or like on my cameras in general. But here's the problem. There's two ways right now that you can go about doing internal neutral density. One way is the way Canon does it, which is to have actual optical neutral density filters and clear filters, because you actually have to have a filter in the light path when the sensor is designed for that, in the camera body. And these filters, of course, can be tuned for whatever performance metrics that the camera needs to be tuned, or you want the camera to tune for. So on the C80 and C400, or C70 for that matter, I think you get 9 stops of internal neutral density, and it's controlled by essentially adding together 2 different layers of neutral density or clear filters to get the overall results that the camera is looking for. Now, maybe I'm just old-fashioned, or I don't know, but this is how I want neutral density done if I'm shooting with a camera that has an internal neutral density. Because it's just a optically dense, attenuating, but still transparent filter, it has no impact on polarization. The other way to do internal neutral density or variable internal neutral density is what Sony does on the FX9 and what Panavision came up with. Panavision and Sony, I think, are both using the same system, which basically works, as I understand it from having scanned through the patents, and only patent attorneys can actually understand patents in any reasonable way, works the way like an LCD monitor works, which is to say you have a fixed polarizer in the camera, and then you have a, I'm going to just call it a liquid crystal. Think of it like a single pixel. When you apply a voltage to a liquid crystal, it twists, which changes the polarization of the crystal. And so the way like your regular LCD monitor works is when you have the polarization of the backlight, say, is oriented vertically, and the polarization of the individual pixel is oriented horizontally, that blocks the light passing through and you get black. If you have them both aligned so that the polarization is the same direction, then that lets the light through and you get white, and then all the shades of gray come from twisting the polarization in between the two, so that they're not either 90 or 0 degrees out of phase. It's essentially the same process that works in a variable neutral density filter that you have in that you might put on your lens. Those are just 2 polarizers, and when you turn the polarizers so that they cross-polarize the light, it really prohibits more light or less light, or passes more or less light through to reach the lens. The problem is that means you have polarization. And polarization in a fixed internal situation can be problematic. Because all monitors are polarized and TVs are polarized, LCD displays are polarized, and it is very easy, because there is no standard for which orientation a display should be polarized. Try wearing polarized sunglasses sometime and looking at different computer monitors. Some will be completely blank, some won't be Some will be somewhere in the middle with distorted colors and so forth. My personal preference is if I want to introduce polarization into my optical path, I want to be the one who knows and is controlling what is being introduced. That's not to say that it's bad or that it doesn't work or that Sony can't do what, that Sony or Panavision can't do what they've done, or that nobody should do it. It's just not my cup of tea, given my understanding of the technology and some of the complaints that I've seen from people talking about the limitations on like the FX9. It doesn't give you 9 or 10 stops of neutral density, etc. Personally, again, for me, I just prefer straight, real optical neutral density in my package. Now, the reason I bring this up is because electronic neutral density, in the sense of the way like Sony does it, doesn't take up a whole lot of room in the camera. It takes up some depth in the lens mount area, but it doesn't take up physical space outside, a lot of physical space outside of that. You have a 24 by 36 millimeter sensor. The 24 by 36 millimeter sensor needs approximately a 24 by 36 millimeter electronic polarized or electronic neutral density unit in front of it, and that's it. That unit's going to be a few millimeters thick, and boom, done, easy. Optical neutral density requires that you be able to move 24 by 36 millimeter filters around inside the camera chassis. And that's the short answer of, it would be really nice to have, but unless you're willing to accept polarization in your camera, either through some kind of like mechanically controlled polarized variable neutral density thing, or the electronic variable neutral density implementation, which again relies on polarization, there isn't space to put that in a really compact camera. Given the size of the given the size of the R5 or the R5 Mark II or the C50, because it's smaller than the R5C, there's just nowhere in the camera to put that kind of technology without, again, making the compromise of polarization. Now, that said, unlike Sony's FX3, FX30, the newly announced Nikon ZR, a lot of the really compact cinema class compact cameras, it's very clear from looking at the product images that Canon is retained or has retained the full active cooling. And that, again, to me is a big deal. Active cooling on the R5C means it can record essentially indefinitely. I have never been able to put that camera in a situation where it overheated. I'm not saying it can't be done, because anything can be done, but it has a big heat sink, a fan, the thermal mass to be able to move the heat to the heat sink and then dissipate it into free air. That's a big deal. Smaller heat sinks, yeah, they work. Look at the R5 Mark II with the fan base. There's clearly a provision in all of that for some cooling, active cooling on the R5 Mark II, but it's a much more compact situation, and consequently, the cooling performance doesn't always meet the camera's needs. You can much more easily, it's more difficult than like without cooling, but you can definitely overheat your R5 Mark II in 120, 240 format, frame per second modes, or 8K 60 or whatever. The highest, most demanding modes on the camera can definitely get it heated up to the point where it's going to thermal shutdown. But I like seeing active cooling. The other thing that active cooling brings to the table that nobody really talks about is stability, specifically thermal stability. So dark current noise, or part of, I shouldn't say dark current noise, part of what affects noise in your images is temperature. And I've told this story before. Back when I was doing photography only, and I was shooting a lot of birds, and I was out like every weekend shooting birds, I got to a point where I could look at my pictures and tell whether it was a hot day or a cold day, just by looking at how the noise looked in the images. Colder days had lower noise. Changes in temperature change the noise performance. And yes, there's things you can do in software on a somewhat continuous basis to compensate for that. But if you can keep the sensor at a fixed or very similar temperature throughout the entire shooting period, whether it's elevated because you're outside shooting in the Sahara and it's 130 degrees, or it's not elevated because you're shooting in, Alaska in the winter and it's -40. But keeping it consistently at a temperature, once you've done all the black balance calibrations, or the camera does the black balance calibrations, then, it's really, it gives you a better consistency over time. The other thing on the body that I thought was rather nice to see is the addition of a zoom switch. Very video camera-esque, if you asked me, but according to Canon, it'll control their cinema zoom lenses. It'll control the Z, the 24 to 105 f2.8Z and 70 to 200 f2.8Z power zoom lenses, if you have the power zoom modules attached. And apparently, Canon has also added a Sony-style stepless digital zoom function. Now, I'm not a fan of digital zoom, although I have to admit I come to all of this video stuff from the world of still photography. And in still photography, I don't want to say resolution is everything, but resolution is everything. When you only have one frame, you really have to put that's frozen in time. You really have to put everything you can behind that frame, because it's going to be scrutinized in a way that frames in video just aren't. So I have not been a huge fan or proponent of the digital teleconverter function on the R5C and the other cinema cameras. And this digital zoom function, I don't know how much of a proponent or fan I would be of it. But at the same time, there's an awful lot of situations, and this applies to photography too, truly. There's a lot of situations where having a picture is more important than having the best picture. And there's a lot of situations where you might only need to zoom in between 1 and 1.5 or 1 and 2, and having stepless control in that range instead of like, I got to punch into 65x zoom or something digitally, like not probably a big thing you really need to or want to do. But I've got my 24-105 on and I've zoomed into 105 and I need to be a little bit closer, and hey, it's a 7K sensor and I'm only shooting in 4K, and I can do that little bit of digital zoom to fix up the composition or get the composition I need. So I think it's really good that it's there. Something else I noticed looking around pictures of the body is it's got dual card slot LEDs. There's one for the CF Express card, there's one for the SD card. It's dual slots. They're different slots, SD and CF Express, which I think is a good thing. I like that. But I like I like the 2 card access LEDs. On the R5s, the R5Cs, you only have one LED to tell you what is going on, and you don't know if which card is being used. So the thing to remember is on the Cinema EOS cameras, you can open the card door and change out the card you're not recording to when the camera is actually recording. And in the case of like the R5C, all you get is a little notification on the screen that says, don't use or don't change this card. But with dual card lights or dual access lights, you would actually see the light flickering over the card that is being used and know not to change that one. They have mount adaptation. So it's an RF mount camera, but the bolt-on, there's a PL mount adapter with the Cook/I data connection. So full, like, given that the mount adapter supports Cook/I integration, and that strongly indicates that the camera can pull all the appropriate metadata from PL mount lenses that use Cook/I interconnect. And the mount adapter is both locks into the RF mount and has bolt-on stabilizers. So that's a big, for anybody who does anything video cinema, you know you don't want a lot of flex in your lens mounts or anything like that. So that's a big thing on that. Big step up there from the R5C. Again, moving this more towards being a cinema camera than just being a bridge. Finally, the hot shoe, it is the Canon, what is it, multifunction shoe, they call it. It does not have the traditional photo TTL pins in it. Presumably, you will be able to use the multifunction shoe to TTL or ETTL2 adapter shoe. I didn't really look into that much, but on the same token, I'm not sure how much of a loss that is, given that this doesn't have the EVF, and I don't feel like this has got the still. I don't think this is going to be the still camera that the R5C is, at least in terms of like ergonomics. I want to talk super quick about connectivity before I jump back to talking about the image sensor and then wrapping this up. So, built-in Wi-Fi. Thank you. Probably the most frustrating thing on the R5C is that there is no built-in Wi-Fi. It is not, well, there is built-in Wi-Fi, but it only works in photo mode. In video mode, the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are not available. On the C50, we have Wi-Fi, but no Bluetooth. Somewhat surprising to me is that the Wi-Fi connection is actually a bit obsolete. It is only Wi-Fi 5, so 802.11 AC. So it only supports 2.4 and 5 gigahertz connections. It does not support 6 gigahertz. Like the R5 Mark II is a Wi-Fi 6 device or 6E device. It supports, the standard is 802.11 AX, and it supports 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz connections, which... So I don't quite understand what Canon or why this is the case. We're on Wi-Fi 7 at this point, is what the latest standard is. And even if you're not going to use the connection at the fastest possible rate, you know, the big thing everybody likes to talk about with 6 and 7 and so forth is it's faster. You get 2 gigabits, 3 gigabits, 4 gigabits or whatever over Wi-Fi. Versus like 1 gigabit or something like that. Even if you're going to limit, or the camera will be limited in transfer speed, because you're not going to give maybe more than a gigabit to the Wi-Fi chip, there's a lot of other stuff that comes with 6 and 6E and now 7 that helps provide a more stable wireless connection. You've got multi-in, multi-out, or MIMO, where the camera uses the phasing of antennas and stuff to do beam direction and all kinds of things like that. You get potentially higher Wi-Fi sync speeds, which will potentially degrade slower. 6 gigahertz, the Wi-Fi, 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi networks they're lower range than 5 or 2.4, because the higher frequency makes walls attenuate things more, but that also means that it's a cleaner RF spectrum in an area that you've got that's well covered in 6 gigahertz. There's going to be less interference there than there is at 5, which is already pretty good, versus 2.4, which is actually really a problem in a lot of ways. I don't know why the old Wi-Fi chip. Clearly, Canon has 6E chips that they're using in the R5 Mark II and the R1. It just seems to me like, again, skews. I mean, I know there's a cost factor. A 6E chip is more expensive than a 5 or chip or whatever, but volume and SKUs also make a difference. And I'm not sure that not putting 6E in this wouldn't have changed the bill of material costs all that much to, really make a big deal. Flip side, though, it does support wired networking, 2.5 gigabits or up to 2.5 gigabits using the USB-C connector and a USB-C to wired Ethernet adaptation. That, of course, leaves me some interesting comments or interesting thoughts on it. Namely, if you've got Wi-Fi or you've got networking going through the USB-C port, what are you going to do for power? Are you going to rely on the LPE6Ps and the maybe hour or whatever you get of recording out of that? Or are you going to go back to dummy batteries? That's a consideration I think everyone's going to have to think about with this if they're intending to sort of network or use it networking. I don't really have an answer there or a real thought there. They also have multiple streaming and network protocols built into the camera. So there's IP streaming. There's Canon's XC remote control protocol, which is a remote interface to be able to control the camera and settings and stuff like that. Of course, the Canon app, which, is the smartphone app that most of us are familiar with. I have no idea how that plays out in the cinema EOS or the video side of things, given that on my R5C, wireless or networking requires a $1,000 grip that I just never bought. The CV protocol, which as best as I can tell has something to do with transferring metadata to a sync server or something like that, and Frame IO, native Frame IO integration, which of course is great if you use Frame IO. It'll upload directly from the camera to the Adobe Frame IO cloud, and you get all that kind of collaboration thing. I have questions. My first question is with connectivity, because it's not mentioned, is will there just be straight FTP support? Like, can I set the camera up like I can on my R5 or R5C and just have it ship files to an FTP server? I don't use Frame IO. I don't use cloud stuff, but I would be more than happy to have my camera networked and then just transfer files over, especially if it can do them as they're shot or recorded, to a local FTP server. I also would love to see integration for Blackmagic Design's cloud storage video thing, just on the principle that if you're going to support Adobe's Frame IO, which, okay, it's probably more popular and probably bigger out there, but if you're a Blackmagic user, Resolve user, and you're using their cloud thing, being able to get your stuff out of camera into their cloud stuff, natively is I think it'd be nice to have. Okay, that brings me to the big question in my mind, which is the image sensor. It's a 7K sensor, not an 8K sensor, which I'm going to argue is a mixed bag. Certainly from resolution, it's a step down from the R5 and the R5 Mark II. It raises some questions for me about why not just keep using the R5 series sensor. Canon already has a 45 megapixel 8K video capable sensor in the R5 Mark II. Why design a brand new sensor from scratch that doesn't have the triple ISO of the C80 or C400? It only is dual native ISO. From a project or product management thing, it just seems like it would be more useful to me to not have just more SKUs for the sake of more SKUs. You're already making R5 Mark II sensors, just make some more. I don't see it being a yield issue. So if anybody's ever done any research, or if you ever done any research into like semiconductor manufacturing, not everything that's manufactured is functional because of defects in the silicon that's the foundation of everything, and defects that happen in the manufacturing process. CPUs and memory and stuff for computers get around this by overbuilding. So you're like, the reason why, if you look at AMD or Intel's product lines and you see like, there's 24 core, 16 core, 12 core, 8 core, 4 core parts or whatever. Well, the reason that you have the separation in cores is a 16 core part is very likely a 24 core part that was manufactured to have 24 cores that had a broken core. And you just disable the core and you sell it as or several cores, and you sell it as a lower tier part. The rest of the part's not bad. It was just the one part of that circuit. Well, that doesn't work so well with camera sensors. I can't disable if a pixel is manufactured poorly or is dead or whatever. You can't just disable the pixel and remap it to somewhere else. It doesn't work in in camera sensors because they're spatially constrained. So if a pixel here in the middle of the sensor isn't any good, that pixel isn't any good. You can't take one from the bottom of the sensor and move it to the top and make it work. So I don't think this should have a huge effect. Plus, the change in resolution isn't that big. I don't think it should have a huge effect on yields. Costs in the semiconductor world are largely a factor of surface area, or area, I should say. So it's still a 24 by 36 millimeter chip. It still is going to cost what a R5 Mark II sensor is going to cost. I don't get the change, in that respect. About the only positive that I can seem to see out of this is it's got fewer pixels, and fewer pixels means less data to be read out. Less data to be read out means less bandwidth necessary, which means less, you run down that line of things. It's kind of why most cinema cameras have sort of stopped at like 24 megapixels, 6K resolution. Most broadcast applications in 4K are going to be downsampled from 6K to 4K. In an actual cinema application where you might want the whole 6K, you've got 6K, which is better than 4K, but it's not like so much more information that it makes a real mess of file sizes and internal bandwidth and all of the rest of the stuff that you have to deal with in the camera when you have that many more pixels. Now, the other thing I noticed looking at the sensor and the performance is that there is no 7K compressed recordings, which I think is a little disappointing. Well, there is one mode in open gate, so you can use the whole 3:2 aspect ratio to record, especially with anamorphic lenses. But otherwise, if you want 7K, you shoot RAW. If you want compressed, because you need smaller files for whatever reason, you are either in 2K or 4K downsampled, or whatever ends up being the case, whether based on frame rate, as far as I can tell. Versus on the R5, R5C, we have full 8K compressed video. If you need, you're shooting something and you don't know if you're going to need to crop in post or whatever, and you can't get any closer and you can't zoom in any further, you can shoot in 8K and you can crop in post and deal with it. And that's not really, again, with compressed smaller files, that's not really an option on that's not an option that I see on the C50. Of course, the real question in this respect is, does this even matter? I know there are a lot of people on YouTube. I've certainly had a lot of comments on this channel about wanting to shoot everything in 8K 60. I don't know where that motivation comes from, or that incessant need. I always feel like there's a thing with photographers, and I'll extend this to people who shoot video, that more is better. So it's better, more shooting in 8K. 8K is more than 4K, therefore it must be better. And I'm not saying that isn't times and places for 8K. I have certainly shot 8K in situations where I knew I was going to absolutely want to either crop in post, or I needed the quality for further processing or downsampling or whatever. It's something I do very rarely, but it is something that I have done. Again, if you want to shoot everything in 8K and 8K 60 and that's your everything that you do, knock yourself out. Don't take me saying that I don't know how important this really is, as a condemnation of your strategy or workflow. But I don't know how important, on the same token, this being only 7K versus 8K really is, and I don't know how of a big deal that turns out to be. Although there is one place that this does, I think, turn out to be a potential problem. And that comes down to downsampling versus line skipping and frame readout times and what actually is going on under the hood. So there is a YouTube channel, I believe it's CVT, that's what my notes say. I could be wrong, I could have letters reversed, that got a pre-release C50, and they did exposure latitude and sensor readout speed tests. They're probably the only channel that I have seen that has done that on these kind of pre-release cameras. And their results were disappointing to me. They came out with a 14 millisecond sensor read time, which is obviously fast enough for 60p. You need 16.7 milliseconds for that. But it's not faster for the 120, 180. The camera maxes out at 180 frames per second. Those would potentially need to be line skipped. Now, Canon isn't saying anything, and unfortunately, CVT, they didn't test line skipping or anything like that. They just did the sensor readout, or at least I don't remember seeing anything in their video about line skipping. But we get to a potential quality issue. And again, I don't have a camera. This is something I will probably be testing when I get mine. But if you take an R5 or an R5 Mark II at 8K, and you want to shoot line skipped for 4K, you can skip line skipping. You read 2 lines, you skip 2 lines because you have to have the full Bayer cluster to have a usable image. You have to read 2 lines, skip 2 lines, and so you do that and you go from 8K to 4K. But what this means is that if you're shooting line skipped 4K, so like 120 frames per second on an R5C, if you're shooting that, it's line at 4K, it's line skipped, but you have a full 4K image that you're working with, that you are, you have the discontinuity of the skipping, which is causing potential moire, artifacts that could, is something that can come up, but you are not working with less than 4K worth of vertical resolution. It's just not the best 4K vertical resolution or the continuous 4K vertical resolution that you might want. 7K can't do that. At 7K, you have less, if you do the line skipping, you have less than 4K worth of vertical resolution when you shoot line skipped. So if the CVT measurements of 14 and change milliseconds per frame read time is correct, and that's not, well, I'll come back to that in a second, then high frame rates would have to be line skipped instead of downsampled, which means you're going to have a appreciable loss of quality. In theory, again, I'm speculating here, on the for the C50 in, say, 4K 120 versus the R5 Mark II or the R5C at 4K 120. The other thing that is concerning about this to me is, again, the R5 Mark II sensor can hit 4 milliseconds in photo mode. It's a full 45 megapixel frame that can be pulled out in like I said, about 4-ish milliseconds, 4 to 6 milliseconds, something like that. Certainly fast enough that you can do 120 frames per second, just straight, like, read the whole sensor. There's a ton of data that has to be processed. There's a ton of memory bandwidth that's necessary for doing that. But the technology, Canon has the technology to do that. Now, I will note that rolling shutter read speed or read time is not purely dictated by the capabilities of the sensor. And what I mean by that is the minimum time that the camera can use is going to be dictated by the sensor, but the actual time the camera uses, as long as it's slower than the minimum time, is dictated by the software. A perfect example of this is Nikon's Z9. In photo mode, it can read the full sensor out, based on my testing, in like 2 or 3 milliseconds. In video mode, it reads the full sensor out in about 16 milliseconds. Now, it's clear from the photo mode tests that Nikon absolutely could make the video mode rolling shutter way faster, like 8 times faster, or close to that. But there are problems downstream. You have compression, you have memory bandwidth, you have a whole lot of everything writing to the cards, buffer and memory, and all of the memory processes. So it is entirely possible that to mitigate downstream problems, the compression, memory bandwidth, whatever, Nikon on the Z9 chose to run a slower rolling shutter than what they absolutely could run, because the downstream can't handle all of the capabilities the sensor can provide when shooting video. And it's also possible, by extension, that the C50 may be tuned to this 14 millisecond-ish rolling shutter time to deal with limitations downstream. It's also could possibly be a power saving function. Obviously, the less bandwidth that the camera needs in terms of gigabytes per second, the slower it can process things, the less power it uses. And so, there's a lot of questions in my mind at least, with respect to what this actually means. Are we going to be downsampling in 120, or are we going to be line skipping? If we're line skipping, how good is the image actually going to look? Because it's not going to be a full 4K vertical resolution, or it's not going to have the full vertical resolution of a 4K image because it's not an 8K sensor, etc. There's also an interesting, on the shutter or camera note, there's also an interesting thing in terms of dynamic range. And the interesting point to me really comes down to published specifications and camera company trickery, you might want to call it. So Canon is claiming 15 plus stops of dynamic range in full frame mode with Canon Log 2 format outputs, and 16 stops in Super 35 mode with Canon Log 2 outputs. And as far as I can tell, because they're not advertising this as dual ISO or dual read or any of the stuff like they used to, the C300 Mark II, I think it was advertised as having dual ISO readouts. So every frame, every pixel was read out at 2 different ISOs so that you could get more dynamic range out of the pixel. They're not advertising that on this camera. And as far as I can tell, they're not advertising it as being anything more than a 14-bit sensor. So how you get 15 or 16 stops of dynamic range? 14-bit sensor can only at best, or 14-bit ADCs can only at best give you 14 stops of dynamic range. Now, the answer to how you get more than that is downsampling. You downsample a 7K image to 4K, and you're going to have more dynamic range than if you were downsampling, or not downsampling at all. This is also why there's less or more noise and lower image quality in line skipped content versus downsampled content. The downsampling reduces image noise, which improves dynamic range, whereas line skipping doesn't have that option or opportunity. So that's going to be an interesting discussion point. See what actually Canon is measuring and what the actual usable dynamic range works out to be in a more quantified manner than what I've CVT did some dynamic range tests. Again, that YouTube channel. They did overexposure latitude essentially. They came up with, I think it was 5 3/4 stops, or 5 2/3 stops is when it started clipping in full frame when they did the overexposure test, which would be, assuming you had 10 stops below their clipping or their 18% point or whatever, then, that would be 15 plus stops of dynamic range, or almost 16 stops, or however you want to look at it. But it would be nice to have some more concrete numbers. Of course, getting concrete numbers for dynamic range in video cameras, given the proprietary nature of the RAW formats and all of that, is not exactly a trivial undertaking. So, with that said, let me wrap this up talking about who I think this camera is good for. Am I upgrading to it? And if so, why am I upgrading? And I want to reiterate what I said at the start of this, that I don't think there's a best camera out there in some arbitrary or absolute sense. There is only the best camera for you at the time that you're using it and for the situation you're using it in. So I don't expect this is going to be best for everybody, and I'm not even convinced that this is the best path maybe for even me. That said, as I said before at the start of this, the R5C made a lot of sense to me when I upgraded or bought one, because I still was a still photographer, and it matched my R5 in terms of all the controls and functions, but gave me full capability in shooting video. And that gave me the ability to go out, shoot video, shoot stills with 2 cameras, and have a whole compatible system. Now, I shoot video with my R5C 99% of the time. I don't think I've ever used I've used the EVF once in the last 2 years or something to that effect. So losing the EVF doesn't make a huge issue to me. I don't shoot 8K, so I don't necessarily care that I'm going from 8K to 7K. That's not really a factor. And in fact, I still have an R5 and an R5 Mark II, and both of those can shoot 8K. And so if I need 8K, I can always pull out my R5 Mark II and shoot 8K when I need that way. I also, for photo side of things, I still have my R5. I have my R5 Mark II. So from a photo perspective, I don't really care that it's got the photo side of things. The hybrid bridge nature doesn't really sell me that much. So for me, I think it makes sense as a video upgrade. Now, my reservation comes back to the whole image sensor thing. I won't know for sure how all of that shakes out until I've got one and I can test, what am I looking at in frame rates in all of the various, high frame rate modes that, I don't do a ton of high frame rate footage, but, and I don't do a ton of 4K high frame rate footage, but I would like to have 4K high frame rate footage that's not noticeably or appreciably worse than what I can shoot with my R5C or my R5 Mark II. So that's an open question. Now, I have pre-ordered one. I'm up in the air as to whether I'm going to keep the pre-order or cancel the pre-order I'm leaning towards keep right now, but I'm kind of continuing to look at whatever I can find, doing the research on the camera. Of course, if I do replace my R5C with a C50, what does that mean for future content on this channel? Well, obviously, we'll get a C50 series. Truth be told, the R5C series really should have just been Canon Cinema EOS OS as it is on the R5C. There's very little in that is R5C specific. Most of it is about the platform or the Cinema EOS OS as a whole, and that applies to really all of Canon Cinema EOS cameras and will apply to the C50 by and large, and most of whatever I do with the C50 will apply to the R5C. My thought process is if I do get a C50, I'm going to probably sell my R5C because I don't see it being as necessary when I have the C50 for shooting video. It just isn't that big of a deal. But I do need to do some comparative testing before that happens. Now, how does this apply to other content creator people, Canon shooters, content creators? Well, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. If you're photo heavy or mostly photo heavy or shoot a significant percentage of photos and you're not looking for a dedicated video camera, I don't think this is a great upgrade. It's better than the rest of the Cinema EOS cameras because it does have the hybrid EOS photo mode. It'll shoot up to 40 frames a second, which is pretty darn impressive at 7K. There are photo situations where it makes sense, but without an EVF, you're going to be working in a disadvantaged ergonomic situation. I don't know if I'd make the jump if I was in that situation. If you're a video-centric person and you are currently shooting with either the regular hybrid EOS cameras or the R5C, the jump starts making the upgrade starts looking a little better or a lot better, depending on where you're at. It certainly makes sense. And my personal experience with the R5C, Cinema EOS OS, etc., is I vastly prefer shooting video in the Cinema EOS OS than I do shooting it in the standard EOS OS. I love shutter angles for the kind of stuff that I do and not having to think constantly about, changing shutter speeds when I change frame rates and stuff like that. So there are definitely places to consider there. It's also the cheapest Canon Cinema camera right now, with the exception, I think the R5C is a bit cheaper. Comes in at under $4,000. The C80 is, I think, 8 or 10. The C400 is more than that. The C70, I think you can still get. C70 is a solid camera, but it's Super 35 only. And I know a lot of people are looking for shallow depth field and all of that, and they're not really. There's a I'm going to call it a prejudice against Super 35 in the hybrid conversion world. So people coming from photo or to like YouTube content creators, by and large, I think there's the camera marketing companies have done a wonderful job selling people on the idea that they need a full frame camera, which for still photography, I think, you can trace through the history of that. And there's a certain level of, let's call it, there's a certain argument to be made there. In video, the world has historically been Super 35. It's gotten bigger in recent years. Obviously, there was always 65 millimeter like IMAX film, but the sort of baseline standard was always Super 35. It's kind of shifting more towards full frame at this point, or 135 format, or whatever you want to call it. But a used C70, if you're really doing video, might be a better, I won't say better, it's hard to say better because it's an older camera. It certainly is capable, but it does have built-in neutral density. It'll have older technology. If you're only looking at current stuff and you're trying to get up to the cinema level EOS cameras, then this is definitely the point to shoot. If you're working with gimbals, if you're working with a robot control system, this also looks like a really good option given its compact size and the ability to run PL lenses and the ability to run the PL intelligent connection and all of that sort of stuff. So I think, again, like everything, it depends. It might be the right tool for you. It might not be the right tool for you. It looks interesting to me enough, like I said, that I pre-ordered one, but, you know, that's also just me. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this one up here. I know this was pretty long, but again, it was a new camera announcement, and discussions always end up being fairly long. Anyway, if you found this useful or interesting, or you have some thoughts on the C50, leave a comment below. Hit the like button. If you're interested in this kind of content or the kind of content I normally produce, which is much more technical, camera-oriented content, consider subscribing and checking out the rest of the content that I have posted on the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.